He boasted that the internal affairs of a nation are no longer off limits to world governments. For his article, Talbot received an award from the World Federalist Association, a group committed to world governments, and a congratulatory letter from Bill Clinton. Later, President Clinton appointed Strobe Talbot to the #2 post in the U.S. State Department.
Strobe Talbot and those who dream of putting the United States under a single global authority know that Americans will never vote for world government. So instead, they talk about global governance, a global village, a global neighborhood, a global economy, a global commons. That means the sea, the air, and outer space. They talk about reforming the United Nations and expanding NATO. The solution to the problems they raise is always more international agencies wielding more and more control over American land, private property, natural resources, economy, trade, military forces, and even our personal relationships.
Well, of course, these treaties that emanate from the United Nations, they are looking after somebody else's welfare, not the welfare and the rights of the American people.
During the 6th Conference of the Parties for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, held at The Hague in 2000, former French President Jacques Chirac made a startling proclamation. He said, quote, "For the first time, humanity is instituting a genuine instrument of global governance, one that should find a place within the World Environment Organization, which France and the European Union would like to see established. By acting together, by building this unprecedented instrument, the first component of an authentic global governance, we are working for a dialogue of peace." Global governance goes far beyond climate change, however. As Phyllis Schlafly, founder and president of Eagle Forum, has determined, it extends into every aspect of our society through treaties and agreements within the United Nations and other international institutions.
All these treaties are dangerous attacks on American freedoms, national security, land ownership, and private property. Every one of these treaties involves setting up a new global bureaucracy that would have some kind of obnoxious control over American citizens, or our families, or our schools, or our businesses, or our use of natural resources and energy, or our land. And together they add up to what is meant by global governance. Treaties are one road to global governance. United Nations conferences are another. These global conferences pretend to be democratic conventions of representatives of more than 100 nations who come together to vote for plans they all agree on. Nothing could be further from the truth. The policies are all written ahead of time, and the so-called delegates are manipulated to produce what is called consensus. The consensus is never submitted to Congress.
The consensus process was so firmly planted before the meeting even began that the opening day of the conference there was consensus formed. That tells me that the United Nations is not a place for open debate. It is not a place for people to share different ideas and for freedom to reign. It is a place instead where the United Nations has an agenda, and they have set the agenda beforehand, and people come to the table in order to find out what their working orders, what their marching orders are, and then they are to go back home and implement what the UN's agenda is.
That the consensus in Kyoto will bind us to reduce U.S. energy consumption by 1/4, and that would have a devastating effect on America's standard of living and on the ability of U.S. wage earners to support their families.
There are essentially 5 major problems with the Global Warming Treaty as it is now being conceived and probably presented. One, there's no clear, concise science. At best, the science is contradictory, it's inconclusive, it's unclear. Second, the economic consequences. The economic consequences, we know for sure, would be disastrous, would be devastating to this country, driving industries out of this country. We would lose millions of jobs, energy costs would go up, productivity would go down, standard of living would go down. Third, if in fact you want to curb greenhouse gas emissions, you certainly don't do that by binding the developed nations and let all the other countries, 130 of the so-called non-developed countries, including China, India, Mexico, South Korea, and others, off. Fourth, national sovereignty. This cuts right at the heart of national sovereignty of the United States of America. We, in essence, if we signed this treaty, would be saying we would allow an international body to come in and dictate to our industries, our businesses, our people, what they could do and what they couldn't do, use of what energy, which sources of energy, the cost of energy, and fifth, national security implications. If this treaty was signed, it would have disastrous implications on our national security. It would mean that we would have to fly less. We would shut down many of our training programs for tanks, armored vehicles, for ships, and for what? To sign this treaty.
The Kyoto Protocol, for instance, to supposedly solve the global warming issue, will not solve global warming. It has nothing to do with actually reducing the carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere. If you know what is actually happening in that, the developing nations, China and Russia and so forth, are not bound by that treaty. They can continue to expand their industry, continue to pollute and so forth forever. And in fact, China is basically going to overtake the emissions of carbon dioxide by the United States within 2 years. And so no effect on those particular nations. They can continue just to increase. Only the developed nations are required to decrease. We have the issue of having to buy carbon credits from those third world nations. So it's a massive income redistribution plan to provide money for these third world nations, and it will not help global warming whatsoever. Even the United Nations admits this.
The roots of global governance goes well back over 100 years. In 1966, one of the foremost and unimpeachable American historians of the 20th century, Carroll Quigley, published a book entitled Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. He spent 20 years researching this agenda and found that there was a quiet effort to create world government with a small cadre of people controlling that government. Because he agreed with the goals of the cabal's efforts, Quigley was given access to all the records for a period of 2 years. On page 324 of his 1,300-page magnus opus are these troubling words. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at. Meetings and conferences still exist today under a cloud of innuendo and conspiracy. They include what is known as the Round Table, which is the core of the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, the Club of Rome, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergs, and many others. Let's just take a look at one of these discussed by Charles Hodgson with